telling systems leaders that they have to do the healing work in all of this, and that they personally have to do it, and they have to create space for their employees, clients, whatever it is, to also heal, is like, that's where the revolution happens.
This is High Tech High Unboxed. I'm Alec Patton, and today's episode comes to you from Rodrigo Arancibia. Rodrigo, who you got today?
Yeah, man, today we got Lindsay Fox from the United Way in Fresno, Madera counties. She's the CEO and president there. I was just super excited and super elated to sit down and talk with her a little bit about what she's learned in her history, working with communities, listening to communities, and what we can actually do to help communities heal in this new time. So I was super stoked to actually get into the mix and listen to her. And so hopefully you guys will enjoy it.
Now, I need to ask, we're an education podcast. United Way is not a school. What was it that made you go, this is an interview I got to do?
First of all, I think like education in itself, like K-12 needs to do a better job of like working collaboratively with their CBO partners, their community-based organizations. And I think there's a lot of lessons learned for K-12 partners and educators at large of what happens outside of the school walls and how we work with our communities. For me, it was really, she has a wealth of knowledge starting from the policy level all the way down to the practitioner level, mostly in after-school programs, but then also breaching into this community-based world. You know, I felt like she had such a rich wealth of understanding of what it takes to listen to communities. And so the hope is that folks will be able to listen to what Lindsay is sharing and then take some of those practices of empathetic listening and take them into the communities and help our communities heal. That was the impetus of having this conversation.
And how do you two know each other?
We first met each other at Boost, the Boost Collaborative at the Boost conference a couple years back, and we had done some collaborative work, statewide work with My Brother's Keeper, and so she had led some of the work with the Sisters Inspiring Change, and I was leading some of the work with the brothers for My Brother's Keeper, and we had some collaborative working in that space, and since then, man, it's been really awesome to see, you know, how she's actually impacting that Fresno Madera area. You know, it's not a super diverse community, and her being one of the leaders of color, few women leaders of color in that space. You know, I felt like that was one of the voices that we definitely need to elevate for sure.
Cool. All right, let's roll it.
My name is Lindsay Fox. I am honored to serve as the president and CEO of United Way Fresno and Madera counties. I was raised in the Fresno area, actually in the rural Fresno County, not actually in Fresno, but out in the rural part of Fresno County. And there's stories behind that I'll come back to, that really kind of made me who I am, and spent about, I guess it was about 10 years in the Sacramento area, which was where I really got into policy, which is the love of my life, and after school programs, which is the second love of my life. And my goal has always been about improving community. And I was raised by a couple of educators, an elementary school teacher, and my dad was the dean of students at Fresno City College. And so education was always the sort of lens that I look through things on. I spent a lot of time with my parents on their school campuses and really came to understand, you know, I'll never forget when I was in 5th or 6th grade, my mom was a 5th or 6th grade teacher. So the kids in her class were my age and they were my friends, like they were my cohorts. I went to school in a completely different context. So I went to school in Clovis Unified. She was teaching in Southeast Fresno. And I remember I can't ever tell this story without crying. So I remember being at school, and it wasn't the first time I'd been at school with her, because I was at school with her all the time. But for some reason, the kids being my age, was one day I just had this realization that there was a system that was in place that was inherently inequitable, and that the education that I was receiving, not that far away from where they were, but seemed light years difference. It seemed like we were in different countries. but we were in the same county, maybe 5 or 6 miles away from each other.
Wow.
And I was getting to experience their education firsthand because my mom was teaching year-round school and I was off for the summer. And at that moment in time, as you know, a 11 or 12-year-old, I was like, this isn't right. And not only is this not right, it seems like it's a really, really big problem, and I'm going to have to do something about this problem. My job on this earth was to fix it. And, you know, there's so many like points in time where you see things like kind of come to fruition and things like come full circle and things like that. And so, you know, today, the office that I run, my United Way, is like a stone's throw from my mom's old school.
Oh, wow.
So it's like, this is where I was meant to be. And I would never, like, I didn't know when I was 11 that there was such thing as United Way CEO. Like, I didn't know that there was this whole state system, the support. I didn't know how the education system worked. I didn't know any of that, but I had a sense that I didn't want to be a teacher. Like I knew I didn't want to be in the classroom. I knew that there was a bigger system that had to be fixed, and that was what my role was to try to fix that system.
Now, in your experience, like I trip out because you, at a very, very young age, you had policy experience and being in that policy mix, and there's a lot of information and a lot of like teeth cutting that you get in that experience. Is there something that you can look back in that experience working either within policy that you can that was an important, real kind of a foundational lesson that you got out of just the importance of listening to the community?
I always joke about my experience in the state capitol working in the assembly, as you know, there were just like some really key lessons that I learned, and I really like that was my job essentially out of college. So it was where I sort of was like learned how to be an employee, learned all of the things about how you interact, how you do your job. And, you know, it's part of what I attribute my hustle to today, because it is such an intense, fast-paced environment. And I was taking on a lot of responsibility for a 22-year-old at that time. And so there's a lot of like really like interesting lessons that you learn in that space. Like it's not necessarily fake it till you make it, but the confidence of walking into a space and being like, I belong here, as opposed to walking into a space and being like, I'm not sure that I belong here. I'm going to sit in the back of the room. Like I'm going to like creep aside. Like those kinds of lessons get you so far in life. But in relationship to really about this listening to community piece, the biggest lesson that I learned was that when the community representatives, so I'm not talking about community members, but those organizations and people who represent the community come into your office talking about what the community needs, that's when you like need to like start asking a lot of questions. And I didn't know that at the time. Like I had no interaction really with community-based organizations or advocacy organizations. So much of this is about translation, right? And I don't mean like language translation. I mean like literally like translating a need to a solution. And so even if you can identify the need, you don't always know that the solution is the right solution once you start working through the details of it. And I was just like, I feel like there's something amiss here, which was part of the reason that I left the state capitol, because I felt like I needed to be working in a space where I could be more directly connected to where the rubber met the road on all of this, and not feel like I'm sitting up here with all this wood paneling in the state capitol and I have no clue what's happening outside. And so when I took on the Foundation Consortium role, I went to every single county in California because I wanted to constantly have that input from multiple sources and to be like validating, right? And to know that the solutions really are meeting the needs. And even though they won't always be perfect and they won't always meet all the needs, that at least we were putting like the needs of people in front of the needs of an organization.
Can you talk a little bit more about like, what are some ways that like we can make sure that like the solutions actually meet the needs?
What I would say is that what I've learned over the past 22 years that I've been doing this work is that number one, like it's iterative. This isn't the type of thing where you say, okay, here's what we're going to do. We implement that thing and then we're done. Right. And like, we never have to go back. For me, like it's all about the implementation side of things, right? That often gets ignored in the public policy process. So the implementers are the bureaucrats. And many times we ignore that part of it. And that's where the real kind of tensions come in the details. So it has to be iterative. You have to think about it as a process that's continually like having to be refreshed. And if you think about like what's happened during COVID, and I was looking at a data set the other day and they were like, well, that was before COVID. And I'm sure like things are pretty much the same. I'm like, I'm sure they probably aren't.
Yeah, they are absolutely not.
Like, I think I'm going to like not make any decisions until I see what the data says after COVID or during COVID, because we're not after COVID, but during COVID. So that's kind of one way to think about it, because not only is the policy context changing, but the way that people approach the world changes. And so we have to actually adapt to that, right? And then the other piece is that the listening process, people think is going to be really straightforward. Right? Like you came and talked to Lindsay and she said that what she really needs is solar paneling on her house. And so you're going to go write a bill and we're going to have solar paneling on like more people's houses. No. People's stories and what's happening in their lives aren't easily pinpointed to a question like, what do you need? Like sometimes it's a 25, 30-minute conversation with strangers, right? That have just like come up to me or we've just started talking to just get their story. And I'm not ever asking them like, what's the solution or what do you need? It's just this like kind of messy diatribe. And then our job as policymakers is to say, okay, here's where we are. Here's the whole sort of mess that they're dealing with. What are the points in that mess that we could maybe start solving for? And then it's coming back to them even in an ideal situation. And what we're trying to set up is more systems where then we're actually centering people in the solutions too. So it's like, tell me your story, but then like, let's see if this iteration of a policy solution is even suits you. Because part of what happens is when things don't suit us, when they're not to our actual user experience, we start using them in weird ways that they weren't intended.
Right.
And once we start doing that, then you have to ask yourself, what's wrong with my solution and how do I fix that? And it's probably because you didn't really like test it out on the user to see. And I think that the COVID response in education and for almost any employer is kind of like an interesting dynamic around that, like to see how people actually act in these situations and what they're truly up against. It's like, oh, you're totally using that wrong, right? Like, like I get it. Like your mask is on, but it's under your nose. So, right, like that's not how the user interface is supposed to.
We talk about a lot about this in the improvement process, right? And I think what I'm teasing out here is like listening and like doing empathy interviews and listening deeply is one part of the process. And then there's another part of the process where you're actually asking, and then not so much of an interrogation, but more exploratory in your questioning. It feels like in education, though, we haven't necessarily gotten to either of those components. Like we're doing some of it through like surveys, and like, the surveys aren't necessarily great, and the response rates are terrible. There has to be something about like putting in the investment of spending time talking to people and pulling out the real stories from that. Like that has to be something that you've seen across the board as beneficial. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. It's my favorite thing to do. Like it's absolutely my favorite thing to do. So part of your question, I think, is about scaling, right? So it's how do you get a system like education or like a United Way or like a local government in the mode of just being like that, right? And because it can't just be one person doing it. It actually has to be built into and cooked into the system. And I'm sure that there's some smarter researcher than me, because I'm not a researcher out there, who could kind of tell you like, well, you would need this kind of sampling, this number. That's not really what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about more is with some of our programming around our free tax preparation program at United Way, for example, is, like we want you're getting $5,000 back. We want you to spend it wisely, right? So let's park somebody who's a financial advisor in my lobby so that when you come in and get your taxes done, then you can go talk to this financial advisor. Like we've tried all kinds of iterations of that. And finally this year, my team, actually without me like even influencing them on this, have been doing a series of follow-up calls with people to not only ask about their experience with our service, but actually to get more details about their story so that we can start figuring out like, where is the human habit here around these things? And what we've discovered was we want people to act a certain way. And this is very typical of government agencies and big organizations. We want people to act a certain way, but people in fact act very differently. So we want people to file their taxes when we open on March 1. But if I know I'm getting money back, I'm taking my paychecks down at H&R Block and like I'm getting my taxes filed as soon as possible so I can have that money in my pocket. And I didn't decide how to spend it the day that I got it. I decided how to spend it 6 months ago. So that's just kind of one example of how, taking something to scale means it can't be me having one-off conversations with our clients. It has to actually be embedded within the system. And then the system has to be able to respond to that. So I've seen many education entities say, like, we want youth voice, right? Like we want youth engagement. So we're going to do this, that, or the other thing to get youth involved and let them present at the beginning of the board meetings and whatever. But if the system actually, if you haven't cooked it in a way that one is actually operating at scale and two, then can truly infuse that into the system to change, it's like, what's the point? Like, don't ask anybody what they think then.
So you talked about the importance of listening to the community. Like, how can we listen to the communities and learn about what they need to heal? Because my sense is that your community, just like ours community, is going through a lot of healing right now, or trying to go through a lot of healing. Can you share a little bit of what y'all are doing in Fresno and how you guys are leading some of that work?
The work that United Way does has always been centered around things like race equity. It's just that we became a little complacent about how important that was and how centralized that was to what was really happening, right? Like we know disproportionate outcomes based on the color of your skin. And during COVID, like we were all like, hey, surprise, guess who is hardest hit by this? And in some ways, COVID, in public policy, we talk a lot about focusing events, and COVID very much for us, we've treated it as a focusing event for many different things. And one being really about how do we just make racism go away in our community? Right. And how do we center fighting against racism and fighting for equity again? And, that COVID, as devastating as it was, did open some people's eyes to like, oh, this isn't actually like a cool thing. Like this is worse than what I thought it actually was. And particularly when you look at things like the racial wealth gap, which is what our focus is. So in our work, we've really decided to focus on several things. One is listening. And so we're spending a lot of time just either listening to ourselves, right? So just like hearing ourselves, like, so internally listening to each other, but then also externally listening to people in the community who are impacted by all of this. And then 3, really helping organizations, particularly educational institutions, listen to their students and particularly their Black students. And that's been like it. Some of that work started well before COVID. So I don't want to like discount that, like, oh, all of a sudden, like we're these race, we were doing that work before. It just, it became the lens changed and it became crystal clear, and it became the thing that was at the center of everything. So one is listening. We're also really focused on learning. So as United Way, we really see that a part of our job is to help educate and give the community resources around just some of the basics. And that learning piece is an ongoing piece, and it really has to be centered on feeding yourself. But like, I may bring you the food, but you're going to have to feed yourself, because I really had this overwhelming response from community leaders. Like, what am I supposed to do? Like, what should I read? Like, give me the book. Like, and there's no one book. This isn't going to be like a weekend process. This is going to be like, you've got to commit the rest of your life to being on this journey, because that's what we've committed to. And then the other piece is really about championing and making sure that we're using our platform at United Way to lift up Black leaders, Black-owned businesses owned by people of color who are doing incredible work in different organizations, but have been totally marginalized by our system. And then the fourth piece, so those three things aren't necessarily revolutionary, right? Like, those three things make a lot of sense to every single leader that I talk to about what our agenda is around, related to race equity and related to rebuilding after COVID. The fourth piece is where it's like, I'm going to need you all to like, maybe sit down. You might need a Kleenex, and like, you're going to have to heal. And so telling systems leaders that they have to do the healing work in all of this, and that they personally have to do it, and they have to create space for their employees, clients, whatever it is, to also heal, is like, that's where the revolution happens, right? Like, all of that other stuff has to happen, but it's really the focus that we have on healing and making healing a really important part of what we're doing and what we're trying, or at least what we're trying to promote. And part of what happened to me, I don't even know if I've told you this before, but my board had given me a short sabbatical, maybe not really, shouldn't be called a sabbatical, but after George Floyd was murdered, and I had all these white men like calling me like, I want to do something. Tell me like how to change my county. Tell me how to change my organization. And I'm like, like, I don't know what to, like, what? Like, this is a lot of pressure. I took a sabbatical, and I was like, what I'm going to do is I'm going to develop this plan for my organization. I'm going to update our plan around the work that we're doing related to wealth creation. And I'm going to like come out with this whole like 5-year strategy on what we're going to be doing. But I know that I probably like have some work to do myself. So I've got 48 hours. I'll give myself the first 48 hours. And those first 48 hours are dedicated to me doing my work. That's what I called it to myself at that point. Me doing my work. I think I even wrote it down. Me work. 48 hours. 3.5 weeks later, I'm still doing my work. And I'm like, I feel like that I just figured something out.
Yeah.
And then and then the realization that I had to go back, because the community was all like my board was watching me, my staff was watching me, and the community was all watching me do this and like waiting for me to come back. And I remember being like, no, like, you actually have to own that, because that's the part that everyone misses.
Yeah.
We're not going to destroy this thing if we don't work to fix ourselves. If we don't first deal with all of the things that are broken within ourselves, all of the hurt that we have, all of the stuff that we've done wrong, we've got to deal with all of that first. So yeah, like, that's the fourth tenet of what we're doing. And it's the hardest part. It's absolutely the hardest part.
This is an amazing point that you're bringing up. Like, we can't do the actual work until we do the self work and the mirror work. And that polishing of the mirror is as important as any other type of work that we have. So any advice for folks about how you can either systematize or even introduce this concept of healing as a community or healing as an organization?
To me, it's about space, right? So it's when you do it on your own, it's about creating that space for yourself to be safe in like, oh, let me remember like every relationship that I've had and like the nuances of every relationship that I've had. And like, was this about that? And was this about like that? And how did all of this play out? And so it's totally doable by yourself. Like get a journal, get some kind of racial trauma healing book and just start in on it. And then, you know, for leaders or people who are leading teams, it is still creating space. And so, you know, we've done a couple of things. One is with our own team. I think we've been really fortunate to work in a field like youth development that kind of leans into this a little bit more, that we've had these conversations, that we talk about being different. We talk about being leaders of color. We talk about the system and the system being inherently racist. But there are lots of people who look just like you and I, who no one has ever given them the permission to ever even have the conversation. It was heartbreaking in my own team to hear, you're the first person who's ever like had this conversation with me. You're the first person who's facilitated this conversation with me, because I started having the conversations as soon as I left the Capitol and started working at Foundation Consortium. Like I got a crash course in what at the time we called diversity and equity, but that's not happening everywhere. So just creating space for people. The other thing that we've done that I think that we're going to do a lot more of is creating space and convening people in safe spaces where they get to be with people who look like them.
I want to tie, you mentioned our favorite space, the out of school time space, the after school time space as a functional like ecosystem for healing to happen. Can you talk a little bit more about like what you've seen in your experience about how important expanded learning or after school time space is, and how that can be used to help communities heal and students and teachers and the whole ecosystem heal?
Yeah, you know, I think that part of the narrative that I would put out on this is the whole reason that I got involved in after school wasn't like after school for after school's sake. Like after school for after school's sake is a great thing. Like, don't get me wrong. After school is just inherently like a great concept. Like we pull great, right? But for me, coming from that, you know, to do the callback, coming from that 11-year-old's mindset of this thing is totally broken. And when I came into the after school space, it was right as we were like in the throes of No Child Left Behind. So for me, it was less about after school programming and more about after school as a platform to do so many of the things that, one, I got in my regular education that kids in Fresno Unified were not getting. Two, that No Child Left Behind was leaving behind. And three, this other like very complex but simple idea around relationships and safe spaces and how we learn and how we relate to each other. And that in its highest form and in its best form, that's what after school is. It's much less about what the programming is and much more about, here's the opportunity for relationships, both with other students who you may not be in class with, but more importantly with an adult and having
adult
a caring
mentors.
adult and having an adult mentor who looks like you. Because after school programs are generally staffed by people of color. And so where you may go through your whole day, I mean, I went through my almost entire education career, K-12, and did not see a leader of color or a teacher of color. So if you can exit that and come into this space where it's like, oh, like not only are these people fun, they look like me, and like they actually like care about me. Like that is actually the secret sauce.
Right.
Like that is what we need more of in our lives is that, because that opens the door to all of the other things that we need to do.
Right.
So I think that after school, I learned I don't work all that much with after school anymore, unfortunately, but I talk about after school in youth development all the time. Right. And especially now when we're doing so much, when I have people's ear around this thing about both healing, and we can talk about social emotional learning on this piece around listening, and we talk about engagement. Like, all of the principles are the same, because what I always knew was that even though I didn't work directly with the students after school, I primarily worked with the adults. All of this stuff for youth translates for the adults. It's all the same stuff. Like, we need to listen to them. We need to give them and like, why are you going to expect that the person who was traumatized by the education system and is now an after school provider and has all of this racial trauma, all of a sudden, like, miraculously healed from it and now knows like how to support someone? So like, all of this stuff totally translates. And so it becomes a safe place for everyone. Like, after school is a phenomenal concept. Just calling it after school or out of school time or whatever we're calling it these days, it doesn't seem like it's enough, because it needs to be called something else.
High Tech High Unboxed is hosted by me, Alec Patton. This episode was edited by Brent Spurnack. Our theme music is by Brother Herschel. Huge thanks to Rodrigo Arancibia and Lindsay Fox for this conversation. Thanks for listening.